Welcome back to What's Going On with Earl Ingram. I am joined once again by my good friend uh, and comrade. Can I use that verbiage?
Comrade, so long as you don't spell it with a K.
The one and only Sandy Williams. Hey, good morning to you, my friend. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. Winter has come upon us, and we're all getting used to it.
Well, let me ask you, Sandy. I've got the sniffles. You've got a little cold. We've been vaccinated, man. I thought we were supposedly immune from this stuff.
No, no, it's good for us. It puts our immune system to just a little bit of work. We've got to have it doing something every once in a while, or otherwise it'll fail us when we really need it. That's my
Yeah.
theory.
Well, let's put it this way. Having been vaccinated, what happens is supposedly we won't be as sick as we would normally be. Is that right? Is that it doesn't
Yeah,
vaccinations doesn't mean you won't contract anything.
yeah, exactly. So that was, in fact, that was I think one of the fallacies during the pandemic was that vaccinations seemed to be getting sold as something that would make you absolutely immune, and then people began to get COVID, mild as it was, and they said, okay, well, I guess we don't need vaccinations then. It didn't help, but it probably did help. You know,
You know, Sandy, I asked you as I was thinking about and watching what's going on. You and I, a couple bluebeards, Um, and so we've been around and saw things in our government at different times. And I wanted to talk with you about the politics of 50 years ago and and where our nation was and contrast that with where we are today. Because where we are today couldn't have happened without what happened 50 years ago, could it?
no, no. I mean, there's been a constant progression, and and in fact, part of what's happening today is this desire to take things back to what it was, with not in it to a predefined but an undefined time. Make America great again as a concept of returning to some earlier time, and presumably that means an earlier time in people's memory. And it's true that today's time is different than prior times, and the world has evolved, and America has evolved, and certainly the political debate and the stridency of our politics has definitely evolved.
So let's begin by 50 years ago.
Well, I'm going to go back. I want to go back
Further
further
than
than
that.
50
Okay.
years because 50 years only gets us back to little post-Watergate,
Yeah.
1975, and so you go back 75 years, you're into the post-World War II,
Okay.
Korean
Yeah,
War
Cold
kind of
War.
time frame. And there we have Ike Eisenhower comes out of being the World War II, the supreme Allied commander. Both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party courted him to run for president as their candidate in 1952, and I guess he flipped a coin and decided to be a Republican, and he won the election over a fellow named Adlai Stevenson, a U.S. senator from Illinois. But Eisenhower had 8 years in office, and it was 8 years of stability, 8 years of other than the McCarthy kind of stuff that was going on in the early 50s up through 53, and then maybe some of the John Birch craziness that was continuing from that, which was all about finding communists in the woodpile. But otherwise, it was very stable. We were in a post-World War II boom, manufacturing wise. Our economy was growing and burgeoning. Babies were being born like mad. All of the baby boomers were being born. And we had this big population growth period, and things were just very stable. And we went from that. We had a Cold War going, and we understood very well at that point who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. The bad guys were the communists, and it was
Communist, right.
mainly the Soviet Union. And the only thing that kind of changed the stability of the 50s was Sputnik and the ability of Russia to and Soviet Union to launch a satellite before we did, and began to put the fear of God into us that we were maybe losing the Cold War, which kind of ran into then a young guy from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, who gets elected as a Democrat, over Nixon, the vice president for Eisenhower, in a very close election. And the transition was very smooth. And the period of the '60s until Kennedy's assassination was again a continuation of this sort of unity kind of atmosphere. Barry Goldwater was beginning to move in the direction of announcing the need to have a real conservative part of the Republican Party. During the '50s, the Republican Party was basically anchored by New England and New York, what we would call Rockefeller Republicans. And the Democrats were the strange bedfellows of Dixiecrats, the Jim Crow Democrats of the South, and the Union Democrats of the North. And
So, Sandy, before you go any further,
yeah,
explain what Rockefeller Republicans were.
well, Nelson Rockefeller was the governor of New York, and the Republican Party had its sort of heart at that point in this kind of establishment financial community Republican Party, which was not terribly conservative. It was basically, it believed in government. It just wanted government to favor business. And, in fact, kind of represented by this guy, Charles Wilson, who was the defense secretary under Eisenhower. He had been chairman of the board of General Motors, and he was famous for saying, what's good for General Motors is good for the United States. And that's sort of how the Rockefeller Republicans felt. They felt that what's good for big business is good for the United States. What's good for the United States is good for big business, and that was kind of the heartthrob of the Republican Party until Barry Goldwater came along and said, "No, we actually are ideologically very conservative. We're interested in states' rights." And it began to be almost a Jeffersonian kind of a debate that was ongoing at that time. And, during the '60s, we'd entertain ourselves by watching TV and seeing Bill Buckley in a very genteel debate. He was the conservative kind of philosophical spokesman, and he'd debate the likes of Gore Vidal and others who were liberals, and we would
On
all be
firing line.
entertained by the
On
very
firing
genteel
line.
debates.
Yeah, a firing line. I used to watch it all the time.
Yeah. And so that was the nature of it was all kind of intellectual. The differences between the parties, they were subject to discussion in a very civilized way. And things only became uncivilized a bit when we had Vietnam and we had the massive demonstrations regarding Vietnam. And however, the country stood behind the Vietnam conflict. It elected Nixon in '68, reelected him in a landslide in '72 when the main debate issue was, should we be in Vietnam? But meanwhile, Vietnam was putting a sharp knife into us, and we had also gone through the civil rights problems in the demonstrations, Milwaukee
So,
and all these other cities that went up in flames.
so Sandy, so I want to get back to Vietnam because here we are, the wars that we had been engaged in, Korea and all those other places, after World War II, for the most part, Americans agreed with, and there wasn't pushback. Vietnam, though, was an altogether different thing, right? I mean, for the first time, was it that television brought that into our the advancement of television brought that into our homes, and now all of a sudden Americans became divided because Vietnam was probably no different than some of the other things we had done in the past.
Well, South Korea, involved, an actual invasion
Right, South Korea.
of the communist the North Vietnamese communist invasion of the South, and so we jumped into that without even much thought. And then there was this hiatus, and we sort of crawled our way into the conflict in Vietnam when the French lost it in what was a colonial battle. It was an anti-colonial war, and when the French essentially lost the grip of their colony, the colonial hold on Vietnam, we decided that it was a communist movement that was doing it, and we sent advisors in, and we kind of edged our way into the conflict, ultimately with the Bay of Tonkin resolution, which gave the president the power to actually operate it as a war. And so I think the problem with Vietnam was that, number one, it wasn't very clear why we were there, and we had sort of backed into it like you back into a cactus. And number two, it went on for a whole bunch of years. It's not like, Korea went on for 2.5 years, and Vietnam was going on for 3 years, at least with advisors, by the time you got to 1968 and the Tet Offensive, where we lost a whole bunch of people. And it was clear that it was not a war that was going to be necessarily won, and it was going to be a war where we might be stuck for a long time with a bunch of people being killed. And so I think it became a different situation because many people in America, particularly the young people who were subject to the draft, had no comprehension of why we were there.
But it divided the nation. And I don't know if those wars prior to it, Sandy, I don't quite remember. Maybe I was a little bit too young, but this one certainly divided the nation. Uh, and if you were on the side of, speaking out against it and protesting against the war, you were considered communist and all those kind of things. But prior to that, I don't think we had that in this nation.
Well, we didn't really have, I mean, we had Korea, then we had these South American adventures of some small scale. We didn't have anything of any great scale until Vietnam again came, and it crept up on us. We had advisors there beginning in '63, and we didn't really have massive numbers of troops there until about '67. And but however, all Americans at that point were subject to the draft, and the war really was an issue for the young. The older
Right.
people were kind of used to them, used to wars. They had been through World War II. They called when the country called, they all responded. And
Yes.
so the conflict really broke down to an age gap. The people on the streets were all people who were probably 30 and younger, and the
Yeah.
people who
College
were
students and
angry
others.
with them was everyone else.
So I guess, Sandy, the only reason I brought that up is we're talking about, what transpired historically. And I was getting to how we got so divided, Democrats and Republicans,
Yeah.
and I thought that maybe that was part of one of the sparks or starting points.
I think it was. I think that began the breakdown of this kind of complete serene civility that used to reign in our political process, where we just had intellectual debates. The differences between the parties were relatively small. In fact, a common complaint in the '60s was that there wasn't much difference between the policies of the Republicans and the policies of the Democrats. And those people who were in the sort of incipient progressive movement, people like Bernie Sanders, who was at that point a young politician, were very frustrated with. And in fact, that's probably the source of him deciding to become an independent back early in his career, was because the perception that there was so little difference between the two parties. And that perception really continued, I think, even through the '70s, even though we had the Watergate, and we had Nixon washed out. I think the stagflation that occurred on Jimmy Carter's watch, with the kind of the failure of our economic system for such a period of time, where we had high inflation and high unemployment and basically a stagnant economy, began to get a lot of people disillusioned, particularly the young people who were out looking for jobs at the time. And we got Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan was the representative then of the part of the Republican Party that Barry Goldwater had started, which was a states' right, hardcore, conservative, ideological party. Um, and however, I don't think that was the real heart of the problem that developed for us. I think the heart of the problem can be probably laid at the feet of the Roe v. Wade decision, which created such a strong political argument over the right to abortion. And it was an argument that started out being discussed rather civilly, but then Rex Reed formed a coalition. He was the architect of forming a conservative religious coalition of the evangelical religions primarily. And that occurred during the '80s. And during that time period, Uh, Whereas these evangelical religions had not been paying a lot of attention to the issue of abortion, even after Roe v. Wade. I think Reed realized that this was a real potential tool for unification of a movement. And they created a movement, a strong movement behind the anti-abortion uh, people. And the fact was that during the 80s, the political debate went from being ideological and political to something that sounded much more liturgical and religious. And the difference became a debate between this idea and that idea to a debate between good and evil. And ever since abortion became such a litmus test, the people who were on the side of favoring the continuation of a woman's choice were viewed as evil.
Sandy, this historical perspective that you are laying out for us uh, this morning is so important to me because it's where I kind of came into my adulthood during these periods of time and watching these things because there were basically a few television channels and you know Meet the Press and other kinds of outlets. Um, they had these Walter Cronkite and others, the nightly news and those kinds of things. They certainly, the focus was on things that, as a young man, you had no choice but to pay attention to because that war was going on. And it's where I really kind of got my feet wet. So one of the reasons why I thought this is just a good opportunity to have this discussion is because as we're going to move uh, on to where we are today, you can kind of see that there was a delineation that took place. It didn't just happen out of nowhere.
No, this thing has evolved, and sociologists look at it as well differently. They look at some things that aren't political, that are just shared experiences. We had all these shared experiences in the '60s, the assassinations, the civil rights
Right.
disturbances, etc. But we also had very shared experiences. We all watched I Love Lucy. There were only
Oh yeah.
every city you were in, no matter what city you were in, there were at
Ozzie
most
and
maybe
Harriet.
three different TV networks. And so if you watched Ozzie and Harriet, you watched I Love Lucy, you watched Milton Berle, you watched,
Right.
everybody watched and
Ed
had the
Sullivan.
same.
Ed
Every
Sullivan.
night, people were sharing an experience in their living room with their families, but they were sharing that same experience with all of the families across the country. And when you got to work, people would talk the next day about what they had watched on TV because they were all watching the same thing. And
So
so
the sense that,
we had
oh,
very shared experiences as Americans up through the '90s, up until cable television, when suddenly instead of three choices or four choices, or when you had the UHF thing on the top of your TV and you could maybe have five channels, suddenly you had hundreds of channels and lots of different inputs to put into your sort of your evening uh, process of watching television. And slowly from the '90s on, these shared experiences that Americans had through their televisions has disappeared. And now, today, you could talk to whoever you want to at work, and you'd be hard pressed to find people who'd shared the same experience you did last night, uh, watching whatever it is you were streaming.
Sandy, we were a more closely knit society, and for better or for worse, that's what we were. And I don't know, maybe at that point in time, I had issues and reasons as a young man um, that I thought things weren't the greatest, but clearly after where we've evolved to, as Trump says, he wants to go back. I don't, there's some aspects of going back that were good for I think, development of people, of relationships. But clearly there were some other aspects of it as well. that
Well, but the thing is, you can't go back to that. You can't go back to four channels. You can't go back
right
to I Love Lucy. You can't go back to the
anything.
situation we had. You can't. And some of it has to do with the tribalism. The fact is that the totem pole of society was very white in the 1950s and 60s, and um, the immigrant waves that we were experiencing at that point were all mostly still European, so that we weren't assimilating things that felt as different as things might feel today in terms of sociological. But I think that our capacity to deal with it, you went through in the 90s, you had Newt Gingrich, Speaker of the House, who was much more of a firebrand, much more of a conspirator in terms of trying to figure out how it is that he could make his party be a dominant party, and they hatched the idea of the state house, the focus of Republicans on state houses across the country. They've noticed and understood the potential for making it a urban versus rural contest. They looked at the demographics of religion and those who are religious, and the coalition, the Rex Reed coalition, became most important during the Newt Gingrich period. Uh, and then after that, the Tea Party. And so, we had a breakdown of what had been the politics of Republican politics and Democratic politics became much more a function of special interest politics, with special interests like the Rex Reed conservative religious special interest, like the Tea Party special interest, the Norquist driven no more taxes concept. And these things became the dominant principles because they were simple, number one, and number two, I think because they smacked of liturgy rather than ideology.
Sandy, I clearly remember when Ronald Reagan uh, came into office, and for whatever reason, there was this something about Ronald Reagan that my father and others, and we looked at Ronald Reagan as the beginning of something that wasn't fair and just. And you know, you go back all those years and you come back to today and you think about what Ronald Reagan did and what he was, it's meager compared to anything that we've had since him. Um, but it just appeared to be something that was beginning, a profound change was starting to take place with Ronald Reagan. That was really nothing compared to what we're dealing with now.
Yeah, I mean, Reagan was sort of an avuncular fellow. He was like everybody's wonderful grandfather. He'd
Yeah.
advertised 20 Mule Team Borax on TV on Wagon Train or whatever that show was.
Yeah.
And
I used to
and
watch him in the
everyone sort
cowboy
of knew
movies.
him. Yeah. And he'd done the bongo, yeah. And so everyone knew him from that context, and he was very good at putting on that air. And so I think he had sort of a likable quality to him. Um, and I would say that really, we can try to blame him because he did do a very good job of explaining to the American people that the enemy within that they should all worry about was big government. He was sort of the beginning of this, let's take apart the New
Right.
Deal, let's really get at it. And that had been an undercurrent for a long time in the Republican Party, but for Ronald Reagan, it became a driving force. Let's dismantle big government. That's the problem. I'm from Washington. I'm here to help you. That was his theory. That was when you hear those words, you know who your enemy is, and that's been the biggest part of the conservative movement ever since, other than the uh, abortion Roe v. Wade conflict, has been the dismantlement of big government and this notion that the administrative state is the enemy that we have to bend over backwards to try and destroy, to the point where we're even willing, I guess, to have this unitary executive an authoritarian president who would take over our government and take it away from um, this silent army of bureaucrats.
So, Sandy, did that coincide with the rise of suburbanization? Because I remember the suburbanization, uh, you know, part of things that took place, and I don't know why I seem to connect that to the time with Ronald Reagan,
Well,
or was it
suburbanization really
before then?
has been a real thrust, particularly ever since Eisenhower started with the freeway movement and freeways that made it very possible to live further from the city center and still get to work in the 20 minutes that everyone hopes they can get to work in when they get in their car or get on the bus. And so suburban sprawl was largely contributed to by freeways and the ability to travel on the freeway and get further out of town and still be within 25 minutes of work. And that sprawl has had a very interesting sociological effect because it did isolate us from one another. When you live in a suburb, you live more isolated from the general community of the city in which you work, to the point where this urban versus suburban, urban versus rural conflict began to develop between suburbs. The people, almost all of who lived in those suburbs, were only thriving in the suburbs because they could drive down to the city to work. Then they'd go back to their suburb and stew and fester about what it is that was going on in the city that caused them problems. But it isolated us from one another in a way that hadn't really occurred prior to that time.
So Sandy, so you mentioned the Tea Party, and I remember the Tea Party well, and so these were people who finally that decided that government, was the problem. I guess they took on that mantra that Ronald Reagan had ushered in, but
Yeah,
for the first time in a long time, they organized, and
yeah.
and and I remember um, they were able to bring pressure on elected officials, and elected officials had to respond to them.
Well,
Um,
Grover Norquist had started this movement of no new taxes, but the basic underlying theory of the movement was let's strangle government of money so that it has to shrink. And we'll just take money wherever we can. We'll shrink it in every way we can. We'll make it very hard for them to raise taxes or to create any new taxes. And so that process over time will shrink government. And that turned into the mantra of the Tea Party. No new taxes, no taxes at all. Let's zero based uh, budgeting, and let's start over again and see what we can cut out of government. And so that, coupled with what had begun to be the gerrymandering prospects, the Republicans, since Grover Norquist, had realized that if they could take control of state houses, they could also uh, patch together districts for not only the state political contests, but also the congressional contests, which might favor Republicans. Democrats and Republicans had always known that they could do this kind of gerrymandering, and it had always been done sort of surreptitiously by both parties when they had control of a state house. But it became a much more concerted and open and notorious kind of theory after Newt Gingrich, in which the theory was Republicans will concentrate on state houses, will concentrate on Supreme Courts in states, and we will reshape the political geometry and the architecture of these districts to lend us greater power. Once they'd done that, then primary contests became the important problem for incumbents in a district in which they were likely to win if they were the majority party in the gerrymandered district. And the and what the Tea Party demonstrated was they were pretty good at coming up with primary contestants. So they threatened incumbents by basically the same threat that Donald Trump is now using, which is if you don't go my way, then we'll help you find the highway because we're going to primary you we're going to find someone that will back in a primary, and our backing will make it very hard for you to win the primary contest.
So Sandy, so we move fast forward to the enemy is your neighbor. If your neighbor is not in the same political belief that you are in, the same party you are in, you are now enemies. So when did we get to that point?
Well, I think, like I said, I think it happened when politics became good versus evil rather than this idea versus that idea. And I think the good versus evil had its primary basis in the abortion fight because the abortion fight was viewed
So
as
back in the 60s,
as a liturgical fight. And then Grover Norquist elevated, I think, the notion of taxes, and somehow taxes became essentially a religion as well. So uh, I think that people's marriage to their party became almost like a religion, and when people fight over religion, it's a brutal fight.
yes, yes. And so Sandy, we've come that far, and so now we're here. And now we're at a point where our nation is as divided as it's ever been in my lifetime, and I don't know, maybe even yours. How do we possibly heal it? Is there a possibility of healing the wound?
Well, there might be. I think that the most recent elections, even this election in Tennessee yesterday, which was much closer than
Close.
had been forecast, demonstrates that people are concerned about the direction that we're currently going. And it could be that, now the debate over abortion is sort of behind us. The Supreme Court has done what it's done. And, there's a continuing conflict about how states will handle it, but it's no longer the litmus that it used to be with respect to political discussions. And it's not something that's discussed very much at all when we get into political debate. So it could be that we'll back off from this notion that political debate is a religious contest, and we might get back to having it be this idea pitted against that idea. And when we get back to that, we'll be in a position where we can, as people, unify on deciding that there are overridingly important things. Some of those things might be a reaction to the direction we're seeing with respect to authoritarianism deployed in this country in ways that might be viewed as simply unacceptable, as well as being deployed in ways that are not necessarily beneficial to the economy other than to the very rich.
Sandy, this belief that government is the enemy of the people, and they've convinced some people that government is the enemy of the people, and so government play has a major role in our lives, and it doesn't matter whether people think it's not so, but everywhere we look, government is there. We just don't see it because it's been relegated. It's been looked at as everything's a handout.
Well,
But
and I
every
think that's
aspect of our lives, Sandy, is government is there. We just don't see it.
I think that the argument about the administrative state and the notion that government is involved with giving money to the takers and taking it from the
Yes.
makers, uh, I think that was easy and fun to talk about when there wasn't a reality put to it. But I do think that this current administration and the Doge movement and all of the rapid cuts that were made and the effects on SNAP, the effects on healthcare costs, the effects on all of these things are demonstrations of the fact that government does actually play a role and that everything government does is not detrimental. In fact, taking government away in massive kinds of ways can have its own very detrimental effect. And I think it's that reality that's beginning to set in. I think, if you overplay your hand about destroying government, you create chaos and anarchy. And I think that so the sense that more and more Americans might be getting is that, hey, we might want to focus on making sure that government operates in the correct way and does the right
Yes.
things and does them
Yes.
efficiently, but government itself, per se, is not the enemy.
Well, Sandy, the educational Department of Education is a prime example. Well, let's do away with it. We don't need it. It's easy to make those statements, Sandy, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's easy to make the statement, but can you envision or imagine the nation without that? An organized reality when it comes to
Well, I mean,
educating the American people.
well, sure. And FEMA being properly funded and
Yeah,
properly
right.
handled to make sure that it actually is providing support. I just think that the reality of government is something that people have maybe taken for granted, based on the battle over it ever since Reagan, when it was identified as the enemy, and it was kind of easy to talk about because no one was really doing anything about getting rid of it. Both parties were continuing with the status quo. And so it became a theoretical discussion. And on a theoretical basis, it's fun and easy to decide that something is the enemy, and if you get rid of it, everything will be better. The real contest is decided when you start getting rid of it and you start deciding whether anything or everything is getting better. And so I think that this administration, in the sort of bull in a china shop approach to government, and a complete cynicism about the extent to which government requires competence. I mean, when you fire people across the board, regardless of their own competence, and are simply taking steps to strangle government. I think the impacts of that, to the extent they're felt by Tom, Dick, and Mary, will cause Tom, Dick, and Mary to get a more realistic view about government.
You
And
know,
I'm not one. I'm a person who believes in the market. I was all for Alfred Kahn's notion of deregulating the airline industry. It turned out very well. Deregulating the gas industry, yep, that worked as well. I think markets are very wise in the way they do things, but I think that governments need to be there. Number one, make sure that markets work, and number two, to do the things that markets simply don't do.
Sandy, you can look at the military and what we are going through right now. Pete Heckstaff, who walked in and just fired long-term military minds that certainly had experience and understood the dynamic of the globe and those kinds of things. And he walked in with that belief that the military is something where a bunch of long-term, lifelong people have been just laying around and pilfering. And you kind of see, Sandy, right now the outcome of that, right? I mean, those people that they fired, who saw the world and who had experience. Um, you get rid of all those people, you get what you have now.
Well, I don't know what we have now, but I do know that the a process of trying to exert the sort of autocratic control, no negative
News.
comments,
Yeah.
no criticisms from anyone to be countenanced or allowed. That's not the environment that the founders wanted. That's not the environment that teachers ever wanted in a classroom. That's not the environment that even families probably ever really want with respect to their children. You need to have people who think for themselves. You need to have people who reach decisions based on a discourse that involves pros and cons. And you need to have deep-seated values that are built into the decision-making process. And I fear that what's happening now with the form of controls that are trying to be exerted, trying to find ways to shut up Senator Mark Kelly for making a
Oh,
statement, to try and exert the power of court martial over retired admirals and generals who might critique what it is that's going on by the military. This is all uh, something that I think the American public will watch and say, that's not the America that's not what I grew up in. That sounds more like the people that were the other side of the Cold War.
so Sandy, do you trust that this nation will wake up? We're starting to see little signs of it. we've seen certainly what has been transpiring over the last 9, 10 months, and maybe 2, 3 months ago, we would have thought that there was no way it was going to, kind of fragment. Do you think that now maybe there's some hope that this nightmare can come to an end, and the American people will realize this is not what we want. This is not
Well,
good for us long
to the
term.
extent that it's perceived as a nightmare. I mean, I think we have to understand the American public was fed up with the way things had been going. At least many people were. They wanted someone who would come in and make changes, would do things that weren't necessarily the way Washington had been working. Washington had come under the thumb of lobbyists and special interests and the large corporations, and someone needed to take them on. And so to some extent, Donald Trump has demonstrated that people can do that. You can do that. Now the question is getting the person in office who's going to do the right things for the right reasons, for the right people. But I think that we should understand that Trump rode a crest of anger and frustration, and it's what has permitted him to be in office as he is. He's a man of great energy. There's no question about that. He's done a lot of things willfully, and I think he's demonstrated that. And I think that the public will no longer have much patience with someone who gets in office and doesn't do much. The question is, what will that person do, and will they do the right things?
So do you think we're going to have an extension? Let's say the Democrats get back in control. Do you think the Democrats then come in and do tit for tat and kind of undo the kind? Are we headed down that path again?
Well, I think unless the Supreme Court does the right thing and starts to put some bridles on the ability of the president to issue executive orders that can accomplish all of the things that seemingly have been accomplished by these executive orders, we will end up with policies bopping back and forth from left to right, depending on who gets elected. And so, we need continuity. We need predictability in our government, and this notion that a president can issue hundreds and hundreds of executive orders on any issue, including tariffs that can raise billions of dollars from American citizens, or all of the other things that are currently being accomplished. If that doesn't get changed, then yes, whoever comes in power is going to use the tools of power that they are offered, and I think that that's the problem that the Supreme Court needs to think about and address.
Yeah, and it needs to think about it and address it right now while this regime is still in office, right? Not after the regime is gone.
Well, yeah, I mean, the tariff decision is going to be a big and important decision, and the extent to which tariffs have been deployed the way they have been, is extraordinary, and it's a huge public policy, the kind of public policy that I'm sure our founders thought would be considered by, taken up by, and determined by Congress, and not by a single individual. But like I said, I think that you have to analyze what's going on without a lot of bias. And if you do it without a lot of bias, I think you can see that this individual has a great deal of energy, a great deal of will. He's definitely extended the reach and power of the executive office far beyond what people might have imagined, and and that won't ever change. That capacity of the president, office of the president, to behave in this fashion won't recede unless there are mets and bounds put upon it by presumably the Supreme Court. And if
So,
it if that doesn't happen, then the next incumbent is can be expected to exercise these powers.
so Sandy, let me ask you this last thing because my fear, one of my fears, is as we go into the new year and people file their taxes and they realize that they're going to get a tax break. The average, you know, mom and pop are going to see more money because of this big, beautiful bill. Never mind for the average person, if they see $2,000 less, they're going to be thankful to see that. Um, do you think that's going to have any bearing on things when we, as the new year takes shape and people see a little more money in their pockets? Never
I don't
mind
know.
that they're paying,
I think
never
that
mind that they're paying more for things.
I think it depends on whether they get uh, bigger tax refunds than they expected. I think that's the only kind of benefit that people experience. If they still owe money at the end of the year, they resent it. Doesn't matter whether they owe 100 or 700 or 7,000. Um, I don't know. That's obviously the cynical political view that you can throw some crumbs to the people at large, give them a couple of $100 and they'll smile, while the top of the heap is taking home hundreds of thousands of dollars
Right.
more because of the tax cut. Uh, I just don't know. The fact is that this isn't a tax cut. This is simply a continuation of the tax cut that existed. So I don't think that they're going to see bigger refunds. I think that they're simply going to continue to see the refunds that they saw before.
Well, Sandy, we'll leave it for there for now.
Yeah.
Uh, Always great talking to you, my friend. We'll be back at it in a short while. So thank you as always.
Yeah. See you around.
All right. That's Sandy Williams, and that's a wrap for what's going on with Earl Ingram.